All right, so before we get started, I'm just going to say a few words to sort of introduce village preservation. All right, so good evening. Um, Welcome everyone. I'm Maya, the Program Associate for Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're here with us today. Um, just let us know where you're calling in or zooming in from today in the chat. You can access that at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you wish to turn on live transcription, you can also do that. Here at Village Preservation, we've been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designations for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host about 75 free programs a year, and we hope to join you at one of our future programs. We have just released our August calendar for our public programs. Our next program will be August 10th. It will be another Zoom webinar. This one will be about On the Spot, which is a short form video collective that focuses about female artists in Manhattan. Our events cover a wide range of topics focused on the history, architecture, and culture of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, and the important role of historic preservation in our communities and our lives. We look at the role of everything from small local businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights, social justice movements, great artists, writers, musicians, dancers, and others sort of connected to the creative legacy of our neighborhoods, as well as the irreplaceable and unique built environment of the village. We are a member-based organization, so your support is essential to enabling us to provide this free programming for our community and to continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, please join or make a donation. You can learn more at our website, Village Preservation. All right, so just a little bit of Zoom protocol. We will be reserving all questions for the end of the lecture. If you have a question, in the meantime, please feel free to use the Q&A function or to put your questions in the chat. Also, if you have any commentary or words you'd like to say, also please direct that to the chat. We like to sort of create a sort of communal space where people can, comment on this lecture as it's going on. Now I'd like to present, the star of the show today, Laurie Lewis. Laurie Lewis' book, New York City First, combines her love of New York. She's a licensed NYC tour guide and her research and storytelling skills. A full-time freelance editor and writer for more than 30 years, Laurie provided a practical approach for one of the most difficult questions for freelancers in her award-winning book, What to Charge: Pricing Strategies for Freelancers and Consultants. As a tour guide, Laurie's jaunts through Greenwich Village include a literary tour and a noshing tour. She also publishes a newsletter through Take a Walk New York. All right, so I'm gonna hand it over to her and we can get started.
Thank you, Maya. So as Maya said, I am the author of a book called New York City Firsts: Big Apple Innovations that Changed the Nation and the World. This book talks about some 300 New York people and places that introduced something new, mostly to America, sometimes to the world. And we're going to look at just a few of these people. I call them pioneers because they were ahead of their time. They were innovators. We're going to look at just about 30 or so, less than 30, who were based in the village. And the way I've organized this presentation today is into 3 sections. We're going to start with artists and musicians because the village has always been a haven for creative types. It's also been closely associated with the LGBTQ community. So we will talk about major accomplishments in that group that were based in the village. And then we're going to talk about some other pioneering achievements that occurred in the village. So let's begin. Come on. Okay, not moving forward. I'm just going to assume that it's temporarily held up. I'm going to try one more time. This is interesting. What I would like to do is begin with artists and musicians. And if I can't get this, there we go. Okay. I guess the computer doesn't like the heat any more than we people do. So what we're going to do is start with artists and musicians. We're going to talk about one art genre and two music genres that originated in this country in Greenwich Village. And then we're going to talk not just about the types of things that these village artists created, but we're also going to talk about where they lived and where they displayed their work for the world to see. So we're going to begin close to the beginning of this nation. When the United States was a young country without a history to speak of, it looked to Europe for its cultural inspiration and its cultural models. And that was true up until around 1820s, 1825, a British artist named Thomas Cole, a young man, came to this country, settled in the village, and went up the Hudson River to the Catskill Mountains at one point, just to see what it was like. And while he was there, he was taken with the scenery, and he started to sketch the scenery along the banks of the Hudson River. And then he returned to his studio in Greenwich Village, and he rendered those sketches in oil on large canvases. And as you can see from one of his early works here, Sunny Morning on the Hudson River, just 2 years after he came to this country, the art that he created showed not just the realism of the landscape, but also the idealism and the imagination of the artist. It was a very captivating genre that a lot of other artists were taken by. Now, at this time, and in fact, all the way up through today, the artistic community in Greenwich Village is very close-knit. And so Thomas Cole showed his paintings to other artists. They formed a close-knit community, and pretty soon other artists based in the village were starting to render works in the same form. As you can see, almost 50 years later, a work by Frederick Church, another artist of the Hudson River School, has the same qualities as Thomas Cole's original work. The Hudson River School is considered to be the first uniquely American genre of art. And you can tell it happened pretty early in the country's history. So as I say, the artists of the Hudson River School formed a very close-knit community. And many of them lived in the village. A little bit later, we're going to see one of the places where many of them, including Frederick Church, this picture you see here on the right, lived. So now we're going to look at two music genres. And if you're old enough, you may have been around when these debuted. In 1967, Joseph Papp opened a new off-Broadway theater that he called the Public Theater on Lafayette Street. And his very first show there was Hair. Hair was revolutionary. It was shocking. It had sex and drugs. It criticized very openly the Vietnam War, which was going on at the time. One of the most shocking things was the full frontal nudity with men and women standing side by side. But what most shocked the theater-going audience was the music. This was a musical, but it wasn't in the vein of musicals the theater-goers were used to. It wasn't Rodgers and Hammerstein. This was rock. Hair was the very first rock musical. Now today, if you take a look at what's playing on Broadway, I would say there's more rock than the traditional Rodgers and Hammerstein style of music. But in 1967, this was revolutionary. After 6 weeks playing at the Public Theater and considerable tinkering, Hair moved to Broadway. What you see on the right here is a poster for the Broadway show of Hair. And it was unique in that it was uncommon in those days, although very common today, for a Broadway show to begin off Broadway, do its tinkering there, and then come to Broadway. Now, I want you to take a look at that building that the Public Theater is in, because I'm going to tell you what that building used to be. Got a good look of it? Okay, now picture it without color. And there it is. The building that houses the Public Theater began life as the Astor Library. And you can see it is nearly identical to the original building. The Astor Library opened up in over 100 years before the Public Theater moved in there. Subsequently, there were several other organizations that used this space before Joseph Papp turned it into the public. But the Astor Library was funded from the estate of John Jacob Astor. John Jacob Astor was America's first multimillionaire. He made his fortune initially in the fur trade, specifically beavers, which were very plentiful in early New York days. And then he did what every successful multimillionaire from New York knows these days, is to parlay that initial fortune into real estate. And so he had a huge empire in real estate, and as a result became America's first multimillionaire at the time of his death. So we've talked about the rock musical. Now we're going to talk about another music genre that was introduced to this country and perhaps to the world in Greenwich Village. If you have been in the village a long time ago, not so long ago, you would recognize the building on the left, CBGB. It closed in 2006, but this was the home of punk rock in America. Now, some people say punk rock originated here, others say it originated in England. I frankly don't know enough about the genre to comment on it either way, but it certainly did originate in America in this CBGB. And here in this village venue, all of the famous punk rock groups performed and punk rock musicians. Here on the right is an album cover from one of the most famous groups, the Ramones. Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, everybody who was anybody in punk performed at CBGB. If the music of Hair was shocking, that was so tame compared to the music in punk. It was loud and aggressive, practically shouted, very fast, even though the instrumentation itself was rather mild, easy. But this album cover barely begins to show what the punksters look like. Black leather was part and parcel of their attire. As that you can see here, but you can't see all the piercings and the studs and the metal spikes that were so much a part of the punk culture in the 1970s when they opened up at CBGB. Performance art. That's really what punk was, as much music as performance. So we've now talked about a music genre that originated in here, the Hudson River School in the Village, and two an art genre, and two music genres, the rock musical and punk rock. And now we're going to turn attention to where do these innovators, these pioneers, live? Somebody asked me shortly after my book, New York City First, came out, what most surprised me about the findings that are included in this book. I had to think about it for a minute. And then I said, what most surprised me is that New York has always appealed to artists. That didn't surprise me. But what surprised me was that New York has had several buildings that were specifically designed as live workspaces for artists. And the very first one that fits into that category is this building that you see on the left, the 10th Street Studio Building. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt. When he created this building, he made it specifically with the thought of artists in mind. And so you can see these huge windows that let in so much light that the artists needed. You can see up at the top here, there is a dome-like structure, though that was for the gallery that was central in this building. Initially, about once a month, the artists would display their works in the gallery to the public. Now, why are there two domes here? Well, when the 10th Street Studio Building opened in 1858, it was so popular. In fact, many people moved in before it was completed. It was so popular that 15 years later, an annex was built. And so that's what you see here with the second building. This is the whole structure now. Why was it so popular? Well, remember I said that the Hudson River School artists liked to be together. They hung out together. And that was true for the 10th Street Studio Building. Artists seemed to really thrive in the company of other artists. But it was more than that. Most artists in the early 1800s lived in boarding houses. And they worked in poorly lit studios. Well, look at the light that was coming in here. And altogether, it was so much more pleasant a place to live and to work that people didn't want to leave. And in fact, that was why they needed to build the second building. So one of the things that Richard Morris Hunt did when he constructed this building was to realize that it was going to be both a home and a workspace. So the studios in here connected with other studios. There was a door that could be opened between the studios, but the living space, that lacked the connection, so that there was always privacy where you lived, but the ability to be with kindred souls when you were working and painting. Now, Richard Morris Hunt was one of the early residents of this building. Now, he was an architect, not an artist in the traditional sense, but in his studio, he started to hold informal classes for up-and-coming architects. And many people consider that to be the first architectural school in America. One of his students was George B. Post, who went on to create the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street and the City College campus uptown. Frederick Church, whom I mentioned previously, you saw his painting Autumn. He was one of the early residents of the 10th Street Studio Building, as were many other artists in the Hudson River School. The Central Gallery that I spoke about previously was taken over a few years later by the artist William Merritt Chase. And another one whose works you might know, even if you don't know his name, was Jean Lafarge. He was an expert in stained glass. And if you know Judson Memorial Church, it has beautiful stained glass. It's right opposite Washington Square Park. he was a resident of the 10th Street Studio building as well. So this building was, as I say, very popular, survived for almost 100 years, 98 years. But then the developers, mid-20th century, real estate developers came along and they decided to knock down this gorgeous building with such a rich history. And now there's just an ordinary apartment building there. Anybody can live there. You don't have to have any talent. You can be any occupation whatsoever. Now, I said that what surprised me was that New York has had not one, but several buildings that were built specifically to house artists and give them a place to work. 15 years after the 10th Street Studio building bit the dust in 1970, another architect named Richard, this one Richard Meyer, converted the one-time Bell Laboratories complex on the industrial far west side of the village into housing and workspace for artists, similar to the 10th Street Studio building. Like Richard Morris Hunt, he made sure that there were big windows to accommodate the needs of the artists. And here, artist was more loosely defined. It could be an artist in the traditional sense, like a painter. It could be a dancer, an actor. Among the famous people who lived in West Bath were the photographer Diane Arbus, the actor Vin Diesel, a sculptor by the name of Robert De Niro, whose son is the actor Robert De Niro. So again, like the 10th Street Studio building, it appealed to artists of all types, and they didn't want to leave. Now, you know that West Bath, incidentally, named for the intersection of the two streets that it's on, West Street and Bethune. West Bath, you know, was not the first housing built specifically as live space for artists. That was the 10th Street Studio building. But West Bath was the first of a different nature. West Bath was the first federally subsidized housing for artists. And because it was federally subsidized, the apartments were really cheap. When it opened in 1970, the studio cost about $100 a month. Today, it's up to about $700, which is still quite a steal in today's real estate market. A 3-bedroom goes for about $4,000. When I talk about the size of the bedrooms, I'm talking about the living space, but all of the units have workspace as well. West Bath became so popular so fast that there has been a years-long wait list for units in many of the years of the life of West Bath. And of course, the neighborhood now, initially it was an industrial neighborhood, not particularly desirable, but now it's become a very hot neighborhood. Who created the first museum in America featuring works of living artists? The answer to that question has been attributed to each of these people shown here, A.E. Gallatin and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Both of them were very wealthy, came from inherited wealth for the most part. And because they had so much money, they were able to amass sizable art collections, which they subsequently turned into museums. They were both artists in their own right, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was an actress as well. So you may never have heard of Albert Eugene Gallatin. He certainly isn't as well known as Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, but he actually opened his museum of living artists prior to her opening hers. He opened his in December 1927. He was the great-grandson of the founder of New York University, and he displayed his collection initially in an NYU building, 100 Washington Square East, and called it the Gallery of Living Artists. A few years later, he changed the name to the Museum of Living Art. And in his museum or gallery, which closed in, we just had to check the year that it closed, 1943, opened in 1927, he displayed works of both American and European living artists. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, on the other hand, had amassed a huge collection of works by living American artists, and she offered her collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they turned it down. She wanted her work to be seen by other people, so she opened up her studio and called it a museum. It was the very first home of the Whitney Museum. And before I show you what that looked like, I want to mention, some of you may be thinking, well, what about MoMA? Well, MoMA opened 2 years after Gallatin opened his gallery. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, another person with great wealth, able to collect a huge number of works of art, and two of her equally wealthy friends opened up the Museum of Modern Art. Wasn't exclusively living artists, however, and it doesn't belong in this webinar because it's always been in Midtown at the present location, just expanded. Okay, going back to Whitney, she decided to, when the Met turned her collection down, she decided to display her collection as a museum in her studio. And this building on 8th Street was the very first home of the Whitney Museum. Now, if you know 8th Street, you will probably recognize this building because it's still standing. When the Whitney Museum moved uptown, another art institution moved into this building and is still there. It's the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture. The Whitney, of course, is back downtown, the Meatpacking District, at the northwest edge of the village. And it also is right next to the southern end of the High Line, which you see here. Now, the High Line is another first. It was the first elevated linear park in America, not in the world. There was one in Paris that served as the model for the High Line. There were other elevated parks in America. There were other linear parks in America, mostly built along defunct canals or railroad tracks. But the High Line was the very first elevated linear park in America. We're going to leave artists now and take a look at some LGBTQ achievements. Nearly all of the events described in my book, New York City First, that apply to the LGBT community occurred in the village. From the 1960s onward, the village was the heart of the LGBTQ community in New York. And it was here in 1969 that the gay rights movement began. It began with the Stonewall Rebellion. Stonewall Inn was then, and is today, a gay bar on Christopher Street. On June 28, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. This was nothing new. Police raids on gay bars were common in those days. And usually the people who were caught up in these raids cooperated with the police and quietly dispersed as they were asked to do. But for some reason on this night in 1969, they didn't disperse. They hung around the bar and on the streets in the park outside. And pretty soon there was a huge crowd. This went on for several days. And it wasn't just a peaceful crowd. It wasn't violent, but it was a crowd that was demanding rights. That gay people have rights. Gay people can drink with their friends without fearing harassment by the police. Now, as Maya said, I'm also, in addition to being a writer, I'm also a tour guide. And when I've given tours that include Stonewall, I often say that it amazes me that in 1969, before the internet, before cell phones, news of the Stonewall Rebellion spread so fast. It isn't altogether surprising that it spread within the village because it was the heart of the gay community in New York, but it spread throughout the country. And this was not only without the internet, without cell phones, there was very little coverage by traditional media. And yet word spread very rapidly, and pretty soon, gay communities throughout the country began to demand rights as well. So the Stonewall Rebellion is considered to be the birth of gay rights movement. Now, as I said, there was very little coverage, press coverage of the Stonewall Rebellion. In fact, there was only one professional photographer there, Fred McDarrah. I try to only show public domain pictures. His pictures are not in the public domain. It's okay to show a book cover, or as I showed the Ramones, a album cover, that you take a picture of an entity that's not violating the public domain laws. So what I have here is a book that Fred McDarrah published that include many of his photographs, including this cover, which I believe is around the time of Stonewall. It's the only picture that I could find that shows what people might have looked like in the days of the Stonewall Rebellion. Well, a year after the Stonewall Rebellion, 1970, the gay community in New York decided to celebrate the event with a parade. They called it the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. Remember, the Stonewall Inn was on Christopher Street. And once again, I couldn't find a picture from the initial parade. I found one from 20 years later, 1989, 20 years marking the 20th anniversary of Stonewall. It was actually 19 years of the parade. And that's the picture on the left. The picture on the right is more contemporary. But let me tell you, even without a picture, of what that initial parade was like. It began in the village and worked its way up to Central Park. And by the time it was there, over 1,000 people were participating, which in 1970 was really pretty amazing, because in those days, a lot of gay people were still closeted. They didn't want to announce their sexual orientation to the world. And yet New York provided a certain sense of safety, so that 1,000 people came out. Now, today, of course, that crowd is minimal by comparison. There are 1 million people, at least, who come to the New York Pride Parade. Cities all around the globe have Pride parades, but New York's remains the biggest. And one of the organizers of that first parade, Christopher Street Liberation Day March, was the man seen here on the right, Craig Rodwell. What you're looking at is an advertisement for the bookshop that he opened in November 1967, prior to the Stonewall Rebellion. This bookshop, which he called the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, is generally considered to be the first gay bookstore, the first bookstore with books specifically focused on the gay and lesbian community. Now, I say it's generally considered. I just recently found out that there was a bookstore in San Francisco that opened up 2 months earlier, that also was intended to be a gay bookstore. Probably different, however, from Craig Bradwell's shop, because what I found about the San Francisco shop was that it later became an adult bookstore, and Craig Bradwell went out of his way to not use pornography, to show only positive images of gay people. Now, he was only 27 when he opened up his shop, and he knew absolutely nothing about running a bookstore, but he really didn't care, because his idea was to not just sell books, and as you can see from this advertisement, other things that people might be interested in such a shop, but he also wanted his bookshop to be a place where gay people would feel comfortable gathering. And indeed it was, because it was in this bookshop that many of the plans for the first gay parade, the first Christopher Street Liberation Day March, took place. So now I want to go to the third such march in 1972. It was still at that point called the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. And this couple in the foreground caught a lot of eyes. It was a woman named Jean Manford, who was walking with her son Morty in the third Christopher Street Liberation Day March in 1972. And she was holding a sign that read, "Parents of gays, unite for support of our children." Now, a lot of people attending this march were moved by it. And they went up to Mrs. Manford and they said, "I wish my parents supported me so much that they would walk with me in an event that was meant for gays." And this really struck a chord with her. She was telling people to support for their children, but she realized from the comments that these parade goers were making that maybe the parents themselves needed support to support their children. So she decided to form a support group for parents of gay people. And she actually expanded the potential clientele to parents, other family members, and friends of gay people. The very first meeting of the support group was 50 years ago on March 26, 1973. It took place at the Duane United Methodist Church, which is today the Church of the Village, and about 20 people attended. But the idea caught on, and pretty soon there were other support groups meeting around the country to support families, parents, families, and friends of gay people. The group used that name, Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, as its name for a long time, but in 2014, it shortened the name to the acronym FLAG, PFLAG, and goes by that name now. And the 100th anniversary, there were hundreds of chapters throughout the United States. So our last entry in the gay section, LGBTQ section of this webinar, is the Village Voice. Now, the Voice, as you know, was a free weekly alternative newspaper founded by men connected with the Village. But what does it have to do with the LGBTQ community? It's not the newspaper that puts that into the section of the webinar. It's a corporate policy begun in 1982. The Village Voice was the very first company in this country to offer domestic partner benefits for domestic partners of its gay and lesbian employees. Now, that idea didn't take off very well. 1982 is when the Voice started. 8 years later, 1990, there were only about 20 companies in the entire country that were offering domestic partner benefits to partners of their gay and lesbian employees. Didn't really take over until the 21st century, but the Village Voice was the innovator here, was the pioneer. So now we're going to look at some other pioneering achievements, ones that are neither accomplishments of artists and musicians nor relevant for specifically to the LGBTQ community. And we're going to look at some inventions and then some food related innovations. And we're going to begin with Walter Hunt, who is one of my favorite characters in New York City First, my book. You probably never heard of him. He was a prolific inventor and a lousy businessman, which is why you probably never heard of him. Among his many inventions were a fountain pen and a machine for making nails. I've listed several others here. And we're not going to talk about most of them. We're going to talk about only the last two listed here: the lock stitch sewing machine and the safety pin. In 1834, Hunt invented a revolutionary sewing machine. There were other sewing machines available at the time, but Hunt's machine was different because it used a needle with an eye at the point, which created a very sturdy lock stitch. It's considered to be the first modern sewing machine. Hunt did not apply for a patent in 1834 when he invented this machine, because he feared that once this machine was out there, it would take business away from hardworking people who supported their families by sewing clothes and other textiles by hand. So he didn't take out a patent, but other inventors were not so altruistic. 12 years later, Elias Howe invented a similar machine, applied for a patent, and won it. And so Elias Howe, you may have heard in school, was the inventor of the sewing machine. A few years after Howe won the patents, Isaac Singer, who of course is the Singer Sewing Machine Company, tried to take out a patent, and it was denied because Howe already had it. At this point, Hunt decided maybe I should apply for a patent because everybody else seems to want to. So he did apply, but the US Patent Office denied him the patent, saying that since Howe applied first and received the patent, they couldn't retroactively give it to Hunt. But they also, in that refusal, acknowledged that Hunt was the true inventor of the modern sewing machine. Now, as I said, Hunt was a prolific inventor and a lousy businessman. It seemed he always owed somebody money. One day in 1849, he was sitting in his workshop on Amos Street, which is today 10th Street, therefore in the Village. He was sitting in his workshop trying to figure out how he could get enough money to pay off a debt. This was a recurring problem for him. And as he's sitting there, he's twiddling a piece of wire in his hands. After a while, he looks down at this wire doodle and he realizes that he had invented something useful, a safety pin. And in his patent application, which he did file, he did receive in 1849, he described the safety pin as a single piece of wire coiled into a spring at one end. That is point B in the drawings. And that spring forces the point, which is that A, into a clasp or a hook at point D. So Hunt did indeed get the patent. And what did he do? He sold it immediately to pay off that debt that was worrying him. Now, if he were a better businessman, he could have made a fortune from this patent alone, not to mention all of his others. But he was not a businessman. And so as a result, he just continued inventing, and his name has been forgotten. Okay, here's a man whose name is not forgotten, Elisha Otis. You probably know him as the inventor of the elevator. In fact, he did not invent the elevator. He invented the safety brake for the elevator. Elevators have been around even in ancient times, and they were used to lift heavy objects up and down, for example, in building. But elevators were considered unsafe for humans because if the cables or ropes that these contraptions relied on broke, then anybody riding in it would plunge to their death. Well, Elisha Otis created a safety brake that made it possible for passengers, for humans, to ride in an elevator. And the very first building with a passenger elevator was this building in Soho that was built, it still exists, and it was built as a glass and china shop. The building with this passenger elevator opened up in 1857. So while the Soho building is the first building with a passenger elevator, the first building with a shaft for a passenger elevator was conceived 4 years earlier in a village building. Peter Cooper, seen here on the left, like Elisha Otis, was an inventor. Cooper was also a firm believer in education, and he created Cooper Union down in the village as a free institution of higher learning. He conceived of this building in 1853. And when he did so, he told the architects that he was pretty certain that passenger elevators would be common in buildings. So he asked them to create a shaft for Cooper Union, for the elevator. And they did so. Here it is. Let me get my pointer to work. It's this big, wide, round structure. Looks like an extra wide chimney at the top of Cooper Union. This is the very first shaft for a passenger elevator. Well, Cooper was right about the desire for elevators. Indeed, when his building opened in 1858, elevators were now happening thanks to Elisha Otis. And while Cooper was right about the desire for elevators, he was wrong about their shape. He thought they would be round, but elevators have always been rectangular. Well, eventually, Elisha Otis accommodated Peter Cooper and built a special elevator to fit into the shaft. And to my knowledge, students are still riding in it. I know there were a few years ago. If anybody here can add what's happening with that now, I would love to know if that elevator is still in use. So we're going to switch gears again, not an invention, and we're going to talk about Fleischmann's Vienna Model Bakery. Charles Louis Fleischmann emigrated to this country in 1876 and opened up a cafe and bakery on Broadway between 10th and 11th Streets. It's where the Grace Churchyard is today. Now, at the time, late 1800s, that area was a very posh neighborhood. It was the poshest in the city. And his bakery and cafe had a steady stream of customers. But at nighttime, when it closed, different people frequented it. Ms. Fleischmann firmly believed that nobody should go hungry. And he and his staff, this is Fleischmann here, again, on the right, he and his staff, every night at midnight, handed out loaves of bread to people who could not afford it. This was not the first time something like this had been done. It had happened in Europe previously. But the term breadline originated here at Fleischmann's Vienna Model Bakery. And then our very final pioneer of Greenwich Village is Cafe Reggio. When it was opened in 1927 by a recent Italian immigrant, Domenico Parisi, he imported an espresso machine, seen here, so that he could serve cappuccino. It was the very first cappuccino ever served in America. You can actually see here, original cappuccino was the sign on the awning. And this espresso machine was absolutely necessary in order to make cappuccino. I don't know about you, but anytime I go by Cafe Reggio and I have time, I stop there and I get cappuccino in honor of Domenico Parisi and his pioneering introduction of cappuccino. Well, that concludes the prepared presentation on Pioneers of Greenwich Village. And I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. While Maya is going through the questions, I'm going to put up another screen that reminds you that this presentation was based on my book, New York City Firsts. If you enjoyed learning about these pioneers, you'll discover so many more in this book. It covers all 5 boroughs from colonial days up until 2021, early 2021. And it's available both in print and ebook format, online, and in retailers, bookstores. If you want to know more about the book and specifically its contents, go to my website, nycfirst.com. Okay, questions?
All right. Thank you, Laurie, for a really fascinating and truthfully wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Maya.
All right. So we do have a question pretty early on. It was about how could artists afford the space if it was so much nicer and larger than the boarding house rooms? I think it was about the 10th Street studios.
Right. Well, again, because this was built specifically with the artists in mind, the rents were relatively cheap. Compared to the need to pay both for a boarding house, which was too small to use as a studio, and studio space, this building that was intended to be both a live and a workspace was a good deal.
Interesting. We've got another question, more of a clarifying question. Like, where was Cafe Reggio in the village?
It was and still is on McDougal Street.
Nice.
What is the cross street there? It's a 2 blocks. So yeah, I think it's 2 blocks, a block and a half north of Bleecker Street.
And another question was Lombardi the first pizza in America, or was it just a sort of a significant pizza spot?
It actually was the first pizza in America. Yes, people always ask that. And pizza is Italian. Lombardi was based on Italian cookery. But yes, it was indeed.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I actually have a question. I would have to say, what do you think is something that surprised you the most during your sort of research process?
Well, as I said, the thing that when I thought about it, when somebody asked me that question, what most surprised me was that New York has had several buildings that were specifically designed as places where artists could both work and live. I don't think any other city in the country can claim that. Some may have one, but nobody has multiple buildings. In addition to the West Beth that I showed you, there's a West Beth and on 42nd Street as well, that is in the same vein as the original West Beth down in the Village. And then there was also a building, the very first condo, the Rembrandt, was also built for artists with workspace, but that was for successful artists because they were going to own their property.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess this is more sort of speculation, but I guess, do you ever feel like, why do you think that New York is so sort of singular in providing housing for artists, or sort of making this sort of space for artists in the way that other American cities seem not to?
I've thought about this a lot. The only thing that I can think of is that New York is, because there have always been so many creative people, and oftentimes they have not been stifled in their expression of what they wanted. I think it was the combination of large numbers and an open attitude. And frankly, the village, with its open attitude, has always been open to people who are different, people who are creative. I think that the presence of the village has made a huge difference in this attitude that artists need space.
Mm, interesting. Okay, so we have another question. Were there any innovations associated with Bell Labs when it came to the village area?
There probably were, but I couldn't tell you specifically what they were. I mean, that was a huge, innovative institution, but I don't know what in particular. I imagine it was, parts of a telephone as opposed to the entire telephone.
Mhm. All right. Oh, and another question was, Marilyn asked, were there other residents like Hotel Tarbells?
Say that again. There are other residents like,
Yes, were there other residences like Hotel Tarbell?
I don't know what Hotel Carvel is.
Hmm.
Could
All right.
could the
I guess
question could the questioner
yeah,
explain it?
yeah. If Marilyn is still in the chat, if she could clarify what you meant for a question. But in the meantime, how about I ask you one more of my questions? I
Sure.
think I'm very interested in, why did you decide to focus on first as a concept for your book?
Ah,
Yes, I know firsts are fun, but they're oftentimes only a part of, the narrative of history.
well, actually, that's a good question, and you practically answered it. Let me tell you how I came upon the idea initially. I was, in order to become a tour guide, you have to be certified by taking an exam. And when I was studying for the exam, I was reading lots of books about New York. And every time I came across something that was a first, it struck me, oh, that's interesting. And so I would jot it down. And eventually I had enough that I could turn it into a book. And so it really came about because I was studying New York history so intently. But your comment about the first not always being the finished product, yes, indeed, that is the case. And that also intrigued me because it wasn't just what was the first, but what happened after that. Did it die? Was it replicated later? And I think with the housing for work live space for artists, you see, no, it didn't die. 15 years after the first housing for artists was no longer available, another one was built because it was in demand. And I think this is something that I saw throughout the book, that, yeah, the first wasn't necessarily the best. It often needed a lot of improvement. And sometimes it was abandoned altogether, but other times it just set the stage for what would happen, not only in New York, but in other places in the country as well.
Hmm. That's such a wonderful way to think about it. Oh, right. So I think Marilyn clarified that she was talking about hovels like the Tarbox Beals apartment. Um,
again, is it possible for Marilyn to come on and explain her question rather than putting it in writing?
Mm. Yes, let me see if I can. Yep, give me one moment. All right, Marilyn, you're
Okay.
unmuted. You can sort of
Okay.
explain your question.
Oh, I have an old postcard, black and white, of course, from it shows Jessie Tarbox Beals in her apartment, like her kitchen, dyeing fabric, and she had really long hair, very almost Art Nouveau looking person, and she was in the village. So I don't know. I think she was an artist. I don't know if she was a photographer, but I think she was more of an artist. And it was such an interesting kitchen, you know. She was doing all of her artwork in her apartment. I don't think it was a studio. And I just wondered, you know, there must have been a lot of artists living in places that were almost like hovels or tenements throughout the village.
Absolutely. In fact, that is one of the reasons why the 10th Street Studio was so popular, because it was good housing for artists. And not only was it good housing, but it also gave them a good space to work. But definitely a lot of artists, I mean, term struggling artist applied definitely to the many people in the village.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, and thank you for mentioning Jessie Tarbox Beals.
Yeah.
I think she's also considered another first, since she was the first female photojournalist and the first female night photographer.
Right. Thank you. She was so interesting looking. Long hair. The way this photograph showed her in a kimono, maybe, or something. I mean, you know, very artsy, bohemian, very bohemian.
Yeah, there's always a lot of really interesting characters in the village, which makes history about it so much fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody. This has been great. Like I said, we will have a follow-up email with the recording and a survey. Please leave all your wonderful comments for Laurie and the wonderful job she did. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maya. Goodbye.